Welcome everyone. I'm Amber. I'm joined with Danny, Sarah, and Kevin. We're all going to be helping you guide through this session today. Welcome to Tray Labs. What is Tray Labs? Tray Labs is an enablement session that has been designed specifically for customers to better equip you for building out the use cases that you're needing and giving you additional knowledge around the Tray platform. Every other week, we just changed it. Every other week, we're going to be providing a new use case and just working through that material together. The sessions are on Fridays, every other Friday at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. So anybody with a Tray account can participate, but anybody can really join. But to really be able to work alongside, you have to have Tray access. All the resources, the videos will be up on our website. The website is tray.io/tray-labs, which I will share out. Everybody should have gotten an invite to our Slack channel as well. If not, we'll make sure that you are added. Feel free to contact us there for any questions around Tray Labs to get additional information. And you can also use that Slack community authentication to play around with building some automation. So some of our use cases will use Slack, and we definitely take advantage of that Tray Labs Academy, or sorry, Tray Labs workspace. Tray Academy is a big part of Tray Labs. So if you haven't had a chance to go through the material there, I highly recommend it. It's just going to add additional important context and just the foundation for you to absorb this information that we're going over. So the structure of the session is we're going to break our workflow down into different sections. We're going to work together through the material. We're going to test each section to validate that it's working as expected, and then we'll leave time for questions at the end. Feel free to raise your hand at any time during the session, and one of the TAs will reach out to you. You can also utilize the Q&A where we can answer your questions there as well. Any questions so far? Awesome. So if you're new to Tray, no problem. As we're building, we're going to navigate through our workflow builder and talk about some of the language that we use within Tray and just where to go to really utilize the tools like, your debug logs, all of your different connectors, how to configure those connectors. So it is okay if you don't know how to use Tray yet, because like I said, we're going to be walking through each step together. So the use case for today, we're going to be looking at bulk operations with Salesforce, and we're going to be utilizing our script step to achieve this. So we're going to look at the benefits of using the script step, what's the difference between using a script versus a helper. So we're going to look at our helpers, and then we'll look at JavaScript, which is what the script step really utilizes. So what are some of the benefits of using the script step? Well, you can see here in the example, we have the same exact use case, but in one where it's importing all of our data, in this case, there's 5,000 records, it accumulates over 125,000 tasks, where with utilizing the script step, we're only using 7. The other benefits here is that you're reducing the amount of API calls that you're having to make, and the complexity of the workflow becomes a lot less and easier to maintain when you're doing things in bulk. A lot of services have bulk operations, but if they don't, it's not a problem. You can also perform these steps of maybe you need to cleanse your data, validate your data, do any kind of mutation in your data in your script step. And then what you can do is then iterate over your data and do it one by one, calling those services that you need, but you're reducing the amount of steps that you're having to perform on each record. Some things to note: with every benefit, there might be a drawback. Some of the drawbacks would be not all services are going to tell you if there's an error. If you're importing in bulk, maybe there's an issue with one record. If you don't do your validation beforehand, the record will just not import. They won't tell you that it didn't import. It just doesn't import. So it's really important that you have to do your validation beforehand. And you can also add in additional logging for records that don't pass your validation that you can then export at the end of the workflow if needed. Does anybody have any questions so far? Awesome. So we're going to take a look at what this looks like in the workflow, and then we'll dive into building it together. So here what you can see is my workflow that I'm using to iterate over some data. So I'm going to go fetch my data from some resource, pull the data into my workflow, and then for each record, I'm going to have to create a data store to then push my data back into after I do my validations on it in my any kind of transformation. So for each record, there's different columns or keys. So for each key, I'm going to go remove white space and then add it back to my list after I've mutated it. And then after all the mutations on every key, all the cleansing of the data, I'm going to go validate the email field. So this data that I'm pulling in is lead data, and one of the fields is an email. So I'm just checking, is the email field valid? If it's not valid, I'm going to come down, check if this returns true or false. If it's true, I can carry on. Otherwise, I'm going to skip that record. Instead of skipping the record, you could skip the record and you could log the record maybe to a CSV or to a database. That step could happen here. So once I have validated my email, I'm then going to go grab all my records or all of my fields for this particular record, enforce a structure that Salesforce is expecting. Then I'm going to go look up the record if it already exists, if I need to create it or if I need to update it. Going down the path of whichever, if it's found or not, I'm then going to go update that record with all of those values, or I'm going to create it. And this process is going to continue for every single record. Where here, what I'm doing is the same thing. I'm going to go fetch my data. My data is going to come into my workflow. I'm going to then do all of that validation and all of the transformations in a single step, which is just utilizing all of these operations. So clearing white space, validating email, and then formatting my data. Those three operations for the different kind of data types that we have are going to take place inside of my script. Once I have my data cleansed and formatted properly, I'm going to create a CSV because that is what Salesforce accepts for bulk import, but many services accept different kind of import format. So it could just be the raw JSON. So in this case, we're going to create a CSV, add our rows, export the file, and then import it into Salesforce. What this looks like inside of our script step is we're passing in the data to our script through a variable. So this is just like a name to your JSON path. So my data is going to come in through the body, and I'm just going to call it rows because this is all just row data. Inside of my script, I'm using the Lodash library, which is a JavaScript library that allows me to perform the same kind of operations that I have for each of these helpers inside of a script step. So here, what I'm doing is I'm going to loop over every single record, but in place, I'm going to create a new list that formats my data in the exact format that I'm looking for Salesforce, which has the fields that I need: email, last name, lead source, status, and company. So from my file, I have an email field that I'm going to remove any white space. So if there's white space on the front or the end or in the middle, I'm going to just rip that out using regex. Next, what I'm going to do is use a trim operation. A trim operation is to remove white space from a string. So this is a string or text value. Like we can see here, this is a text helper. So this is a text operation. It's doing the same exact thing, but with the JavaScript operation versus just calling on the helper. So here I'm removing white space from the front and the end, where this one removes from the middle. Maybe people have two names in their last name, so I don't want to actually rip out all the white space, just from the front and the end. Human errors happen when inputting your data. All right, so we're going to do the same thing for our source. There is no status in my file, but I'm going to hard code it for everyone because these are going to maybe be new records. So here, what I'm going to do is then the same thing for my company. Once I have my data formatted, I'm going to come down here, take that newly formatted data in the list, and I'm going to filter out any invalid emails. So this is just using regex once again, which is a pattern matching language where I can take this regex statement and test if my email is valid or not. If it's invalid, I'm just going to remove it. Instead of removing it, what I could do is put it to a separate list to then send out after the workflow is completed to say, hey, these are all the records I could not actually process because of invalid emails. So once this is done, this is going to return your transformed data that we can use in the CSV. So here you can see we're using regex to do a pattern match inside of tray. We can do the same thing with our text helper and utilizing the regex regular expression match test. So here I'm testing my email address. I just hard coded an email in here. And then I have my pattern that I just found on Google. And I'm just checking this is going to return true or false if this is a valid email or not. I can use the Boolean step to then say, this is true, carry on, false, skip the record. Awesome. So now we're going to build out the later version of the workflow where we're going to use the script step to do this in one swoop. So our first step that we want to do is focus on authentication, and then we'll look at fetching that data and transforming it in our script. Then we'll create our CSV that we need to do our import, and then we'll actually do our import to Salesforce. Does anybody have any questions so far? Awesome. So if you haven't already, what we're going to do is navigate to the developer.salesforce.com/sign up. From here, you can fill out the form. It should take only a few minutes. Put in your information, verify your email, and you'll be ready to go. So everybody, if you could now navigate to your tray account. I'll do so as well. From your tray account, I'm going to land on my dashboard. You might be in your organization level workflows. You can navigate to your personal workspace by toggling between workspaces here on the far left. This is organization, so everybody has access to these workflows, where personal is just you. So if you want to share these workflows with everybody, feel free to use that organization workspace, but I'm going to keep mine in my personal workspace for now. I can always change this later on. From here, in my workflows dashboard, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on Create New Workflow. So once I click Create New Workflow, I'm going to name my workflow. I want to name it something meaningful that, you know, when other people look at this, they might recognize what's happening in this workflow. The nomenclature I use here is Tray Labs. And then what I'm going to be doing. So this workflow is bulk updates with steps. And then once again, you can choose if this organization or personal. I'm going to keep it personal. I'm going to click next step. From here, this is going to prompt me my triggers that I have to select from. We have many different triggers that are readily available to you. Most of these that you're seeing here are utilizing a webhook, which offers automatic communication between two applications. Without you having to make the request, the data is just sent on some event. If you don't see the webhook that you're looking for, you can always utilize our universal webhook. Some of the other triggers that we have available that we've gone over in some previous courses are the alert trigger, which is a special workflow that allows you to get notifications if something fails. A callable trigger, this allows you to parallelize out your processes to increase the optimization of your workflow, how fast it's running, and make it scalable and easier for people to collaborate if stuff is broken out into smaller pieces. We then have the form trigger, which allows you to create a custom form with all the fields that you need, including a file upload. Once the data is submitted, it's sent directly to your workflow. There's also the schedule trigger that allows you to run your workflow on some cadence, completely up to you. Most of our workflows, we utilize the manual trigger because it allows us to click a button and run our workflow as needed. This is great for data migrations and for testing. So go ahead and click on manual trigger and click create workflow. From here, this is going to open up your workflow builder. So in the center here, you have your canvas with no steps, just the single trigger. To the left is your connectors panel, where you can find all of your core helpers and your services. All the services are the different pre-configured connectors that you have available to you. If you don't see a connector that you're looking for, much like the webhook, we also have the HTTP connector that we've gone over in a previous course that allows you to make API calls to any service that has an API available. Awesome. On the right side, we have the properties panel. As you can see, we don't have any properties because we have not selected a step yet. But if I were to click on to my trigger, you can see that this is dynamically pulling in the configurations needed for this trigger, which aren't much other than changing the name. So what we're going to do is go back to our connectors panel and find Salesforce. So I'm going to start to type in Salesforce. I can find the connector. I'm going to click down, drag it onto my workflow. Once it's here, you can see that there's an indicator. This is telling me that this step requires additional configuration before I can run my workflow. So I'm going to make sure that this is clicked on, it's highlighted, and now I can see the properties are reflecting this connector. In the connectors panel, over here in your properties panel, we're going to authenticate this connector. So what we're going to do is click on New Authentication. From here, you're going to name your authentication. The naming convention I like to use here is square brackets. Inside my square brackets, I put what the environment is. So this is a developer environment. So I might put dev here. And then I'm going to put what the service is. This is for Salesforce. And then whose account does this belong to? This is my account, so I'm going to put Amber's account. And I also like to put a date timestamp because when I have a lot of different authentications, maybe I need to know what is the most recent. So here I'll just put the date, which I don't even know what date it is. 7/10/20. So here I also have the option to change who has access to my workflow. So I can share this personal level or organization level. If it is in a personal workflow, you need to have, you can use personal or organization, but if it's an organization workflow, it needs to be organization level authentication. So you're going to click next. From here, you can change what environment you're using. Though this is a developer account, it is a production environment. So we're going to click on production. I'm also going to tick the API permissions. Once you do that, you're going to click on create authentication, and this is going to create an OAuth flow that allows you to log in as that user to give Trey access to make calls on behalf of you to your service. So I'm going to click Create Authentication. This is going to show an pop-up. For me, I've already authenticated and I've closed this out, but for you, you'll have an option to log in. Make sure you're logging into your developer email that you've added. Once you've done that, your authentication should show in the drop-down. Was everybody able to authenticate their Salesforce connector? All right, we'll keep going. Not yet. Okay, no problem. Please let us know if you get stuck and we will have somebody assist. And if you need me to go back over any of the authentication process, please feel free to raise your hand. So once again, click on New Authentication, give it a meaningful name, pick who can access this authentication, click Next, click out, check out the different permissions that you have available, click New Authentication. This will prompt a pop-up for you to either log in, or if you're already logged in, it'll just ask you to accept or allow Trey to access. This will then, once you authenticate, it will close that window and bring you back to your workflow that shows the drop-down. Please let us know if you get stuck. So once you've authenticated, we're going to test our authentication. So we always want to verify that the authentication worked before we move on. So what I'm going to do here is change my operation. So the operation that I'm going to choose is some kind of list or find record would work as well. We don't want to have to send data, but pulling data is the easiest way to test your authentication. So here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just look up accounts. So from here, this is cool. I'm going to look up accounts. From here, I have my account, and I can't just pull accounts, I need to put in a field. So the field that I'm going to use is just the ID. So I'm going to pull all accounts and pull their ID. So once you've selected your operation, your record type, added a field, and these are all dynamically being pulled in from your developer account, go ahead and click Run Workflow in the bottom right corner. Once you run your workflow, navigate to the Debug Logs. And from your Debug Logs, what you're going to do is click on the latest execution, which is green. It's just showing me it was successful. And I'm going to then click on my Salesforce steps so we can see every step that happens. I just have 2 here. Click on my Salesforce. I can see that I have my input. I always like to examine my inputs and my outputs. So inputs look correct. I'm looking for all record accounts. The object is account, and I'm going to pull back just the ID. You can see there's already some data available within your Salesforce account. So you should see a few IDs coming back. I can expand this by clicking expand so I can see a bigger view. And this looks great. So I can then assume that my connector is authenticated. One thing to note, inside of your connectors panel, you can also click use output. And this is going to refresh your output at the bottom of your properties panel at what data to expect from this connector. Awesome. Does anybody have any questions before we move on? Great. So after we have authenticated, our next step is to fetch and transform our data. So what we're going to do here is we're going to update our trigger to use a webhook. We're going to use a webhook to simulate data being sent into our workflow from another service versus us hard coding the data in the workflow. So we're going to create a little helper workflow that just is going to be sending the data to Trey, the other workflow. Then we're going to add a script step, configure the script step with the script that I showed you. Then we're going to pass the data from the trigger into that script, write that JavaScript, and then we'll test that. So back in our Trey account, what we're going to do here is we're going to click on the trigger. You can either click the trash or the 3-dot indicator to replace the trigger. I'm going to click on webhook. Once I have the webhook here, I can enable my workflow to then start accepting data in the bottom right corner. That's what I'm going to do. I don't need my Salesforce for now, so I'm just going to delete it. We'll come back to that. So the next thing I need is a script step. So I'm going to search for my script step in the left connectors panel, click and drag on to my workflow. So that's all we need to do for now. Now we need to be able to send data to this workflow. So what we need to do that is go back to your dashboard. In the top right corner, there's an X. Go ahead and click that. And then we're going to click create another workflow. This is going to be our little helper workflow that's going to simulate that data being passed in from some other service that we don't need to add additional services. So we're just going to simulate that through another workflow. So here I'm going to call this Trey Labs, and I'm going to do this as data helper. That should be fine. So this is my data helper workflow. I'm going to click next step. The trigger for this workflow is going to be the form trigger. So go ahead and click form, create workflow. Once again, this will open up your workflow builder. I'm going to click on my trigger, come down here, scroll down to my inputs. I'm going to add a field. My field is going to be a file upload. So I'm going to click file upload. I'm just going to call this CSV because we're going to be importing a CSV. So I've imported my CSV here. And then what I can do is enable my workflow. Once I've enabled my workflow, I'm going to add my CSV steps to create the CSV. So I'm going to import the CSV. I need to make a copy of it to then grab the data to send to my other workflow. So I'm going to look for the CSV editor, and I need 3 of these. So, or actually 2, sorry. You need 2 CSV helpers here. The first one we're going to click into. This is going to be create CSV from file, which is what the default value is. You can then add a JSON path to your file from your trigger that we're going to import by clicking and holding down the dot next to the field name, pull it up to your trigger. Then you're going to select the URL. Once you have that, we don't need to change anything else. So we're going to click on to the next step, which is to get your row data. We want to pull all the row data from here. So the operation is going to be get rows. My ID is going to come from the first CSV that we created. Once again, use the connector snake, pull it up, release. This will show the options you have. I need the ID, so I'm going to click ID. That'll populate a JSON path to dynamically set that value in this connector from the previous step. You can always use values from previous steps, but not steps from below. The step I'm going to start on, or the row I'm going to start on, is 1. And I want to pull all my rows. So I'm going to use another JSON path to my first CSV and click on rows. This gives me the total rows in my file. So once I have that, I need one more step, and that's going to be an HTTP connector. And this is what we're going to use to send our data back to our workflow. So I'm going to be using a post because I'm sending data. The URL, what we're going to use is the public URL from our previous workflow. So we'll fill that in just a second, but we can go ahead and configure the body. So the body that we want to use is raw, and it's going to be coming from our CSV2. So go ahead and click and drag it and select rows. So the CSV, the rows is coming from row 1. We're going to start at row 1, and the total rows is coming from our previous step because the output we can see at the bottom of our connectors panel. This is the information we get back. What columns are in the CSV, the ID, and the total rows available. We use the total rows available to say, I want to pull all these rows in. So use that total to say that's my ending point for the CSV to pull rows from. So we have our steps here. We now need to add our URL to our previous workflow. We can go back to our tray account by typing in app.tray.io. You should already be authenticated into your tray account. So from here, what I can do is go back to my workflow that I just built, click into it to get the URL. I'm not going to use the URL up here. I'm going to go to my workflow settings in the top left, click on workflow settings, click on the workflow public URL. I'm going to copy that to my clipboard. Now I can navigate back to my previous workflow that I kept open in this tab, or you can go back to your dashboard to get to that. And I can click back into my HTTP step and paste that value. So I'm going to be sending value. The event is me sending the value to the workflow to that trigger. So this is using a webhook. This event is sending data directly to. I don't need to request the data in this workflow. I'm sending it from this workflow. And I'm sending in my row data. So once I have all my steps configured, what I want to do is I want to now import a file. I have a file for you guys that you can download. I'll put the link in the chat. Let's go ahead and grab that. Whoops, didn't copy. Share up the link. Copy, okay. And in the chat, you'll have a link to the CSV that you can download. This is an example CSV with, I think it's 5,000 rows in it. Let me know if you cannot access that to download. So I'm going to go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. We had a question on CSV1 from Eric. Eric, is that what you wanted to see?
Oh, I just wanted to see the helper workflow again and the details of CSV1 because I didn't get it properly set up.
No problem. So CSV1 is all you need to change because we're going to leave the default operation, which is create CSV from file. We don't need to change any of the other configurations. We just need to pass in the CSV that we're making a clone of. And the CSV is coming from our trigger. So I use a JSON path to my trigger, and then it will show you your options, which you should see URL. If you're not seeing URL, that means you need to make sure that your field is a file upload.
Got it. Thank you.
Definitely. So once again, go ahead and download the file that I sent. So here I'm going to just come in. My Zoom is in the way. I'm going to download this file. So I have my file downloaded, and now I want to go import that file. So I can import that file by going to my workflow settings, copying the public URL, pasting the value. From here, I can see that I have a nice form that I can import my file from. So I'm going to choose file, click onto my bulk example CSV that I just downloaded, and I'm going to submit my file to my workflow. As soon as I click submit, I can then go verify that the file is being sent. So I can click on debug, and you can see here I have an execution running. The CSV is being created, so I just need to be patient and let the CSV create. Once it creates, it will send the data to our corresponding workflow. Does anybody have any questions so far? Did anybody have any issues grabbing that file? Awesome. So while we're waiting for our workflow to run, one thing to note is I haven't labeled any of my steps. If somebody else were to come in here and look at this workflow, they wouldn't really know what's going on without having to click into every step. So it might be important, it is important to label your steps, giving some description here, a short description, and then a longer description in the step description, which can be seen when you hover over it. So each step, we would update our step title. Oops, looks like I have a failure. Let's make sure I'm linking to my CSV properly. Going to let that retry. As you see, I didn't even retry that. Tray retries in the background. If something fails, it will continue to retry as long as the data is coming in. So I'll let this run. We'll come back to this. We want to go back to our other workflow and start to configure that, and then we'll pass the data into that workflow if it hasn't already passed. As you can see, Tray corrected itself. I didn't have to rerun it or replay it. It sent the data, it retried and sent the data along. So we can see we got a 200 here. I'm going to go back to my bulk workflow here. And I can go to my debug logs and I can see that the data was sent here. I can see all my data and I'm sending it into my script step. Well, I haven't quite yet sent it into my script step. I'm going to do that now. So I'm going to click into my script, and in the properties, you have a way to send data into your actual JavaScript by creating a variable. So we have one, for example, here. And what we can do is call this rows, or you can call it foo. Try to name it something meaningful every time. Here, what we want to do is we want to pass the data from our trigger into our script step. Going to go ahead and click and drag, release, and I want the entire body. It's not always just going to be body. It might be nested further in, but I didn't nest it. I just have it straight in the body that's sent over. So what I want here is passing that in. Everything looks good there. Now what I want to do is click on the edit button to edit my script. So we're going to write out the script together, but if you'd rather copy and paste, I also have a link here. Let's do shareable link. I'll put this in the chat that you can see the script from. So looking at the script, you can open it up and just copy and paste this into your script step for a quick fix, but I'm going to write this out and explain what's happening. So the very first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to deconstruct my variable. My variable is passed in as an object. So it's going to be input dot whatever I named it. So in this instance, it's going to be input dot row. I don't want to have to put input dot rows every single time I want to reference that data. I just find it a little bit cumbersome, so I can then deconstruct it in this manner. So I'm going to write the word const. I wrote that to the chat. And then I'm going to use a pair of curly brackets. Inside of my curly brackets, I'm going to put the name of my variable. So this is the key that I'm looking for inside my object. And then I'm going to put an assignment, and my assignment is to input. So I'm grabbing this value, and now I can just call on rows versus having to do input rows each time. Not necessary, but I find it a little bit easier when trying to reference this value over and over again. So now that I can reference my rows, I want to now update what I'm returning. So I'm going to be returning the configured data that I am going to write out. Like I said, we're going to be using Lodash. What this does is it's going to use a few operations from Lodash, which we have a Lodash connector as well if you're doing one-by-one record, but in this case, I'm using it in here. So I'm going to be using the chain method to use multiple operations, and I'm going to be using map. So that's the first two steps that I'm going to do inside of here. So I'm going to do underscore dot chain. This is saying I'm chaining multiple operations. And then I'm going to pass my data in. So I have my rows here. I can then press new line, and then I can call on my next operation. I don't have to do underscore dot. I only have to do underscore dot once. Now I can just call on the next operation by pressing dot. And I'm going to use the map operation. Each operation is invoked, or like how we call on a trigger, it is executed by passing the parentheses. So here, this is an operation. I'm then invoking it with the parentheses and passing data in so I can do something with it. So I'm saying I'm going to be chaining some operations. With that operations, I want to have access to my rows. And then the next operation has access to the row data. So in here, for each row, I'm going to do something. So what's shown here is I have rows. I want to access each row. So all my rows, and then for each row, I'm going to be doing something. So what I'm going to do is I can call this chicken, but it makes more sense to put row because I'm referencing all my rows, where in here, I'm referencing just one row. So for one row, I'm then going to put comma, and then I'm going to, actually not comma, I'm going to put equals, and then I'm going to put an arrow. And this is going to say I'm going to perform some series of steps. I'm going to be writing a function that's just saying, a function just executes a series of steps, right? I'm going to execute something that I need to do. What I need to do is I need to take my row data and format it and validate it. So to do that, I'm going to then put curly brackets to hold all of my information, all of my steps that I want to do to this data. And then I'm going to return, what I'm going to return is some data. So I'm passing all the rows in. For each row, I'm going to map over it, which is just looping over it. And for each row, I want to create this formatted data and return it out. So I'm going to type in return. And what I'm going to be returning, I want to format an object. So I want the data type to be curly brackets with key value pairs. And each key is going to have the corresponding value from my row data. So for each row, I'll create this object and return it out into a new list for me to use. So curly brackets indicates my object. And then I'm going to put each key. So each key I need is email, last name, lead source, status, and company. Let's see if I can remember all of those. Email, and then I'm going to come back to that. Already forgot it. Last name, and let's make sure. Last name, lead source, and then we have status, and then last but not least, company. So now I need to fill in each of these keys to have value. I need to reference my row and then the key in the row. So if we go and look at our CSV has a row for email, a row for last name, a row for company, and a row for source. So here, email is going to be for each row. I'm going to grab the email column. So I'm going to say row dot, or you can use square brackets, whichever you prefer. If you use square brackets, use quotes, and then you can write email. So I'm referencing my row in my email column. I'm going to grab that value, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace all the white space, right? So I'm going to use the replace method, just like we're using map, or just like we're using this function. We're calling on a operation to perform some steps, and that's to replace. So I'm going to use the replace method, and I can invoke it, but I need to, after I call it, I need to say, what am I replacing? So inside of it, I'm going to pass in what my regex statement's going to be. So what that looks like is this. So you're going to do // s /g, comma, and then quotes. And I'll put that in the chat. What this is doing is it's a pattern matching, and this is saying find all space globally. The G means everywhere. That's a global value. It's looking through every single character in the email for a white space. And then it's going to replace it with what? It's going to replace it with nothing. It's going to remove it. So that's what this pattern matching does. This is a regex statement. After I've written my email value, I'm going to do comma. And you can see now this is blue. I'm ready to move on to my last name. So same thing I'm going to do here is row. And I'm going to put in last name. I have to use square brackets here because there's a space in my key. So if I wanted to reference it like this, I wouldn't be able to because there's a space there. So I need to use square brackets. That way I can reference it. So I'm going to keep it consistent and use square brackets for everything. So now I have my last name, and I want to remove white space. To remove white space, I use the operation. It's a string operation or text operation that you see all in our helper, which is trim. This removes any white space from before the first character and after the last character. And when you're typing in data or you're pasting in, sometimes you get some invisible or white spaces that can cause some issues with your data. So I'm just cleansing it by removing any white space. Now I need to do the same thing for my lead source. My lead source, I think, is just called lead source. I can look at my CSV, and actually it's just called source. So here I'm going to type in row, square brackets, and I'm going to type in source. So source maps to lead source. And I'm going to trim any white space. Followed by comma. The comma indicates there's going to be a new key, a new row. So this is now going to bring me down to status. Status doesn't actually exist inside of my file. So this is just going to be a hard-coded value. You can put anything in there. I think it does need to reflect a status within Salesforce. So I just picked one. You could do some logic to dynamically set this as well. But here I'm going to just put in open space dash space not space contacted, followed by a comma. This is just a piece of text. All text in code or in JSON or in a workflow is wrapped by strings. You don't have to put quotes when you're using a value within a connector, but within the script step, you have to make sure you wrap it in quotes. If you use a single quote, it needs to be closed by a single quote, but you can also use double quotes as well. Inside of your connectors in the properties panel and in each input, if you are referencing an object and you use square brackets, you can't use double quotes. You need to make sure you use a single quote, something to note. Last but not least, here in our mapping, we need to do our company. So this is going to be row, and I'm going to grab the company column. like I did for my last name and lead source, I'm going to trim any white space or any additional characters after the first and last. So there we are. I have my operation here. What it's doing is it's taking the entire rows, and for each row, it's now creating a new object. So each one of the objects from our file here, it would be key of email, last name, company, and source with the value in it. So I'm taking that value and formatting it how I want it and removing or replacing any spaces. Finally, what we want to do after we've gone through every single row, we're going to filter out any row that has an email that's invalid. We don't want to send invalid emails to our Salesforce instance because we want to try to keep our data as clean as possible. So if we have invalid emails, that can cause some issues if we're trying to then take that data and put it to some other service to send out emails or do follow-ups. So we're going to use the filter operation from Lodash. Filter is just going to take all of your values, and then it's going to evaluate according to some evaluation that you provide. So our evaluation is going to be doing a check if our email is valid or not. If it's valid, it will return true. And so our filter is looking for true or false. If it's true, it will return the value back to our list. Otherwise, it's going to remove it. So we'll have a list of just valid emails. So we're going to use the filter operation back in that script that I sent you. You can see we use filter just like we did for map. We're going to use row, and then we're going to write some regex just like we did up here. This one's just a lot longer because we're looking for very specific characters. So inside of our script, outside of our first operation, so you can see on line 14, that's where this ends. I can tell that it ends because I'm looking for the closing parenthesis that I opened. I'm going to press enter and add dot filter. Now that I have filter, just like I did for map, I need to invoke it. I need to say run this method. Run the method, and I'm going to pass in the row data that is returned from here, and I'm going to filter it by passing in the row, calling a function. The function is going to be, this is the series of steps I want to perform for this row. Curly brackets, open it up. This is where we're going to put our steps. I will go ahead and put the regex statement in the chat. So we've got time to type this out. So that's going to be the regex statement. So I'm going to create a variable to hold it. I need somewhere to store it. So a variable is a way to store values. It's just a name to a value, just like how we created a name to access all of our row data. We can create additional variables in our script. Whenever you use the data store in a workflow, you're basically creating a variable to store some value that has a key, an identifier that has some value in it. I always think of it like when you have like a storage facility, you have identifier to know where all your stuff is in your storage container, right? You have like the ID or like your number for your storage unit. So a variable, it has a name to reference where all of the value that you're storing. What you're storing is completely up to you. Here we're going to be storing a regex pattern. So I'm going to create a variable. It's not ever going to change, so it's a constant. And I'm going to call this, I don't know what I called it here, RE for regex. And then I'm going to paste the value that I put in the chat, or you can grab from here. When you copy from the chat, sometimes you might pick up extra characters. I recommend grabbing it from the file I sent. Paste that in. It does not need quotes, right? This is not a string. This is a pattern we're going to use. Finally, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my return, which is going to test my value. against my regex pattern. So that's going to return, and I'm going to do my row. I'm going to test that it matches this pattern. It has these characters. If it doesn't have it, it has like some additional character like a parenthesis, then I'm going to say it's not valid. So I'm going to say, take my pattern and test it. This is an operation, and I'm going to pass in my row data. What this is going to say is take all of this pattern, test this value against it. It's the row dot email, or we can keep it consistent and do email. So I'm grabbing my row data, grabbing the email field, and I'm going to test this value against it. That's going to return either true or false. And if it's true, the entire object is going to return back to our list. If it's false, it will remove it. Any questions on the method that we just wrote, the two methods that we just put in? I know we're coming up on time here. If you need to drop, feel free, and this will be, the recording will be up on the Tray Labs, but we're almost through with our use case here. So carrying on, we have one more thing we need to do here to be able to use this data in the next steps of our workflow, which is to press enter outside of our filter. So I have dot filter. I'm going to then do dot value. What this is going to do is going to return everything back here. So this creates a chain. The chain needs, we need to access the data from it. So there's data available in here, which is the rows. Inside of the rows, for each row, we're doing an operation. We're doing another operation. We're going to take the final result and return it out of our script to be used in our workflow. So once I have this, like I said, you can just copy and paste from the script. You're going to press save. So once I press save, I'm ready to move on to my next steps, which is to create my CSV. So what we're going to do for that is we're going to add 3 CSV editors. We're going to create a CSV. We're going to add the headers that we need. And then we're going to add the row data from the script step to the CSV, and then we're going to export the CSV. So I'm going to come to my connectors panel, type in CSV. I'm going to drag the CSV 3 times. From here, what I'm going to do is now configure this. I'm going to be creating a CSV, but not from a file. I'm just going to be creating a CSV. So how many columns? There's 5 columns. How do I know what those columns are? Well, we just created them inside of our script. Their email, last name, lead source, status, and company. I know this because these are all the fields that are available within Salesforce on a lead. I went and investigated this beforehand. So I have my 5 columns. I need to state what those columns are. So I know it's going to be email. The type is going to be text. The next one I can see here is last name. So I have my last name, text. The following is going to be lead source. Type is text. And then I have 2 more. The next one is source, or sorry, status. This is also text. And then finally, we have company. So all of those objects are going to map to these columns in our CSV that we just created. So we have our CSV, has all of our columns in it. Now we need to add data. So clicking into the second CSV, I'm going to add rows. Once I have my add rows, I need to know what CSV it's coming from, just like we did in our helper workflow. I'm going to grab the CSV, pull it up to the ID from CSV1, click ID. This will dynamically set it. Now I need to add my rows. I don't want to hard code my rows in. I want to grab them from my script step. So I pull it up to my script, and I already have my formatted rows provided in my script. I've already done my validation, so I don't need to check this. I have my row data, and now what I need to do is export my CSV. So I'm going to come to the third one, click Export, Export CSV. Once again, grab the ID from the first CSV, give it a name. This is example.csv. This can be anything. So now I have my data that comes in, configured in my script step. I create a CSV, I add my rows, and I export it. So what I can do is test that this is working properly by navigating to my debug logs. And I can see data's already been passed to my workflow. I don't have to go back to this workflow to trigger it. I can just replay the data that I have. So let's go ahead and click debug, click the latest execution, make sure that there's some data there. I see my data. I'm going to replay this, and I can see the execution retrying or replaying. And you can see it's very fast. So I had my CSV. It's too large to see here. It's one thing to note that there is a limitation to how much data can be passed in at any given time. So like a service, even in bulk, there are limitations on how much data can be passed in. And so we want to be aware of how much data is being sent. So we might even have to, in some cases, batch out our bulk operation. So if you have like 10,000 records, you might cut that in half, or in some way it's still doing a lot of data, but we have to keep in mind these limitations that Salesforce has or the other services that you are trying to use, along with all of our steps in our documentation. Every connector has limitation how much data can be pushed in, and you can read up on that there. So we can see all of this ran as expected. I created my CSV, I added my rows, and then I exported my data. And remember, I had 5,000 rows, but now I only have 499. So I must have had an invalid email in one of my rows. So now I have my CSV that I can send to Salesforce. Does anybody have any questions? Great. So now we're going to add our final step, which is our Salesforce step. From Salesforce, I'm going to click and drag my Salesforce connector. With my Salesforce connector, I can select my authentication I already have. The operation, I'm going to type in bulk, and I'm going to click bulk upsert record. My record type is a lead. So I'm going to type in lead, select lead, and now I can pass in my CSV from CSV3. So I'm going to grab my connector snake, pull it up to CSV3, and I'm going to collect the entire file. So it's referencing my file here. Last but not least, I need to have a field to look at to see, does this record exist or not? So it needs to, this is how we're going to check if it's going to be creating or updating. So the field I'm going to be using is the email field. So I'm going to type in email. It doesn't always show you the options here, so you can hard code values by typing it in and then clicking set to. So that's the value I'm going to be using for my external field to check for existing values. Once I have this, I can go ahead and go to my debug logs, replay, let that replay. We can wait for Salesforce, and we can see the status of our upsert. So it shows here when it was created. It shows the state, which is completed, and we can see that it has ran. So if you go to your Salesforce instance, which I'll go to mine. I think I already had a bunch of records in there, but it's going to refresh, and you should now see, or it might take a couple seconds for you to see all of the leads that you have imported. All with just, how many steps did we end up using? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 steps. So awesome. And that is it for the use case. Feel free to ask questions if you didn't get something completed or have a confusion around anything. Please feel free to unmute yourself and ask away.
Could you show the details of the first CSV editor?
Absolutely. So inside of the CSV editor, directly underneath the script step, my operation is create CSV. So there's many ways to create a CSV. You can create it from file, XML, Excel. I'm just creating it from nothing. It's going to be a brand new CSV. And then I'm going to put in 5, because that's how many columns I have. That's the columns I've created in my script.
Yep.
And then I added 5 columns. You can either type in add more than 1 column and type in 5, or you can press the add item 5 times.
Okay.
And then I put in each column that I created in my script step that I have available also. If you just pulled up that file, they're all listed here. So each one of these represents a column header. So email, last name, lead source, status, and company. I configured my data to match what I want my CSV to look like, because this is what Salesforce is expecting. So I create those. I just put text as my data type, and then I'm not adding any row data. So that's all you need to do here.
Okay.
And then for CSV2, you're doing add rows. The ID is going to come from CSV1 as a JSON path. The rows are going to come from your script step.
There's my problem.
And then you don't need to do your validation. We did our validation in our script step.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's good. I think that'll get me what I need. Perfect.
Awesome. Yep. And then just to reiterate over the export, we're doing export CSV. We're grabbing ID from where we created it. And then we are naming it. You can name this pretty much anything. So go ahead and name it. Add your Salesforce step with the bulk operation. Run your workflow by going to your debug logs and just replaying the data so we don't have to import it once again from our other workflow. And you should get a job ID and information for the import from Salesforce, which will give you a status. You can use that ID to go check the status with another Salesforce connector, or most of the time it's pretty fast, pretty spontaneously completes like instantly for me. So you can see here is upload is complete. All right, we did send out a poll. If you get a chance just to fill that out, would be very helpful for us to keep providing material to you guys that help what you're looking for. Next week, we're going to be looking at, or not next week, next section. I keep forgetting we're on bi-weekly cadence now, but we're going to be meeting on the 24th, and we're going to be creating a Slack modal. So this is a pop-up that you can ask for additional information with Slack commands. We'll be using our Slack Tray community to create this. So if you don't have Slack, no problem. You'll be added to our Slack community.